In this project, my assignment was to create process-based training for a role known as Integration Vice President. They actually manage the complete integration of companies which are bought by a bank that I have a contract with called ESW Capital. So the process is very, very fast-paced and needs to be handled with the most meticulous detail. So basically, they are absorbing a company in 90 days, essentially. So let's get started and see what I did for this one. First of all, I did a lot of research on how the process was actually done, and had to identify all the phases during the acquisition and put together the logistics, coordinate the different, what they called assembly lines. They try to do it in like a factory fashion process. So anyway, so here's how it basically works. The entire process involved around the target company, which is the company that's being purchased, the integration vice president, which is the role that I'm designing this training for, and your integration work streams. Work streams meaning the software programmers, your finance department, legal teams, human resources, and there's a lot that comes into play when you're talking about acquiring a company and putting it into a central model. So they're buying a company here, as I emphasized, and then they're taking it through an assembly line process, and they're putting it into a central factory where it's run as part of a large-scale development factory, if that makes sense. So we start off here with just explaining a little bit about what the process is. And then we go through the role of the banker, the person who identifies the company that would be a good fit for the central factory. And then how the process starts, the pre-close phase, how the work streams identify the logistics. It could be the 5-year return on revenue that is most appealing to buy the company, and the fact they can shrink it down and consolidate labor or maybe product lines that aren't profitable. So they have to take an A to Z look at the entire company and decide what needs to be done and what data asks need to be sent to the target company. And when I'm talking about data asks, I'm talking about what this company that I did a project for, it's a bank, what they're going to ask the company that is being sold. So that's the first part. And then I go further on down the line with timelines, phases of the acquisition. I tend to repeat the first slide a little bit, the first lesson. So we go into detail a little bit more here. So the banker will ask the company that, oh, hey, we need this information from you before we sign what's called a letter of intent, which is an agreement between this bank and the target and then the company that buys the software companies, that they'll provide a certain amount of data, whether it's human resources, the code, and we analyze, how messed up their code is. Does it need a lot of work? How many releases they've done with bugs in it? What kind of issues they typically have, ongoing issues, meaning what their clients call in. When their clients call in for certain issues, what are the primary tickets? Just part of the web, the technology just doesn't flat out work. What are the issues involved in the day-to-day operations of this particular product? A lot of the times it's like their accounting softwares, their procurement softwares, see a lot of CRM softwares, some social media type of software, excuse me. So what happens at the end of integration and so forth. So it goes into extensive detail with phases. And when I was talking about what we ask of the company, we start off with what's called a 3-phase data ask. So this is where I detail the process. So it boils down to logistics and what makes sense. If you are being hired by this company to manage one of these acquisitions, what do you need to know? It's very theoretical because, as we know, a lot of things in practice take a turn, twists and turns along the way. Here's our letter of intent. The types of companies that ESW typically buys. asset purchase, divestiture, all assets, insolvent purchases, direct stock purchases, merger, stock purchases. And what we ask before we hand over, we actually buy the company, the money's being exchanged. We want to know a lot about this organization if it's worth buying. So we'll do our data ask here. And then there's a lot of signups that happen to take place. Integration vice president has to sign off that, oh, they've looked at all the information that they've received. And let's going back to our pre-close data asks, finance, HR, legal, engineering, SaaS operations, and services. And from this information, they create what's called a gap analysis. And I talk a lot about that in the training as well. What it means, it could be relating to cost. Of course, three things. Cost, is it technology a fit? Is it going to be run with the same quality as the legacy company that ran the operations? And so forth. Cost to maintain infrastructure, hourly cost of fixing a bug, fixing a release, that sort of thing. So it's just an A to Z process-based training that's been created for this particular situation. Because from the gap analysis, they basically produce what's called a Joe chart, and that basically shows if it's favorable to purchase or not. So we look at payback charts and overall alignment with the central, what's called the central factory. Once again, we're buying a company that we know nothing about or know a little bit about. It's just favorable because it could be run in the cloud. And then we are looking at the financial situation, subscriptions, licenses, hardware, that sort of thing. So it's a lot of responsibility on behalf of the integration vice president at this stage, because they have to analyze all the facts that come in, legal facts, HR facts, financial facts, and then make a decision. So there's a lot of due diligence that comes into play. So this activity is just meant A to Z process. So once it's basically approved, let me click back, sorry to keep clicking around here, with our final pre-close data ask, that's when it's signed off. And then we continue to do our due diligence, and then we close the deal if we figure out if the IVP, along with what's called the SVP, our senior vice president, determines that it's actually a great buy, it's going to be profitable, we're going to make it work, we're going to fix any problems, it's not going to be too much trouble, then we go ahead and we close out the deal and make the arrangements with the seller through the banker and proceed with our purchase. And here I talk a little bit about what happens in the pre-close phases, the key items, the deal kickoff, the IVP request, and just what it's going to take to get the process rolling. So you can see from our timelines, there's only 4 weeks actually that happen until it's closed out and we start our integration planning. So this talks quite a bit about that. I would imagine if you're new to this type of role that it really is very hands-on when you're going to learn everything that's going to happen. So if I'm to click into some of the training and analyze it further with a gap cost analysis, this is what our gap cost analysis will typically look like. So all the information's there, but meticulous review of this information needs to happen, like I mentioned earlier. And I do provide an explanation of what the gap analysis is. And this is related to cost here. That being said, we do have something known as a people plan. Of course, these are not real names here. Or this is just, if you'll see there's business functions, corporate communication, customer support engineering, finance, everything related to roles within the organization that this company, this client that I have is going to be buying. What's the HR plan? How are we going to transition the legacy people? Shown here, for example, customer service. We need to transition them over to our integration function. So that's a very important task right there. So voila, that's the very first part of the IVP role training that I've done for this particular organization. So we left off at our pre-close phases. A lot has to happen before they decide to close. Obviously, the gap analysis needs to happen. Our Joe chart, which determines if we're going to go ahead and integrate. Another thing that's done during our integration process before the money's exchanged is what's clone specs are produced by our product management team. Basically, our engineering teams will coordinate with the legacy engineering teams and will produce clone specs. It has a way for the product management team to understand the complete technical design of the product and why it's designed that way. Maybe they're products that have just started becoming obsolete. We don't find them useful anymore. We don't need to manage those particular product lines. So by the time all this is done, we start preparing integration plans. And of course, our resources. So once the buy decision's basically been made, we really ramp it up. We recruit our work streams. And again, those would be engineering teams, IT operations. IT operations meaning they're going to be migrating different systems from our company. Budgets are prepared. People are hired from legacy. They're offered maybe a bonus to stay on with us, to integrate the company. They may be offered full-time roles. It just depends on their skill set and where there's a fit. Okay. And further discovery processes happen. Due diligence processes, ongoing integration issues. Hopefully by the final week, our P2 product specifications are complete, meaning they've copied all the specifications, anything that needs to be done, if necessary, to the product. And then there's a countdown to the integration process. And if we take a look at it, this is the fastest and most rigorous part of the process, is a 90-day integration process. And that basically means this whole company needs to be absorbed into our central model in 90 days or less. So we have the 7 assembly lines, as I was talking about earlier. They're basically work streams. We have engineering, finance, HR, and legal, product management, SaaS operations, our integration assembly line, kind of keeps everything together, oversees everything, sales management, and services. And let's take a look at what they are. There's also something called out of model, which basically is when an import is sent to a business unit because it can't be run in the central factory, it doesn't fit the code, it doesn't have the same code stack as central model. So it's better suited to be outsourced and run by a company that matches its business model, even though this bank will still buy it. So let's look at, I also defined our 7 assembly lines. When I talked about integration, that's basically the integration vice president has to run all the assembly lines to keep them going in Smartsheet. So here's a recording, and here I'm explaining how the project is run by Quality Bar in Smartsheets. And that's a whole other explanation in itself, how we put together a quality bar system in Smartsheets. You can kind of get a feel for it. Basically, the IVP manages all of these teams, all the assembly lines I just mentioned. Which basically, these work streams sync with the Jira ticketing system. So once the Smartsheet overall plan is activated, it goes to the Jira ticket, and that's how it's managed. What our quality bars are.
What happened to make our integration successful? The most obvious
small snippets of what each assembly line does, what they're responsible for.
This quality bar. We need quality bar.
So another 10 minutes and I will be done describing this particular module, because this module was actually 3.5 hours. I actually broke it up into smaller modules too, so if you're working and you want to take an hour of it or half an hour at a time, you can certainly do that. So once these assembly lines have performed their responsibilities, the company goes into the post-integration phase, which is usually a week. And we need to make sure that all the assembly lines are what's called in model, which is really important. Because if they're in model, that's the only way our central factory can run this particular company in a big group. And these are basically descriptions on the in model state. And I also put together lessons. As you can see, this is lesson 8 of 25. That help our integration vice president understand what a disclosure schedule is during an acquisition. Basically saves a lot of money on legal fees, and each IVP must review disclosures so they understand if everything's consistent when the company's bought, because it relates to the legal documentation that was provided at the sale. So to know if I can go ahead and
Hello, today I'd like to discuss with you disclosure schedules. Due diligence phase. Legal provides a strict timeline, warranties, and other information that is truly.
So your intellectual property, key product functionality, affirmative disclosure, negative disclosure, and so on, is what I review. Private versus public. Making sure everything's accurate and complete. And we got to make sure that these disclosures are in line, as described here. Does it fit with the buyer's due diligence investigation? Is there a lot of new information that's conflicting? So that kind of thing. And then, of course, another very important part of the process is our pre-close phase communications. What everybody says to the company that we're going to buy before it's actually bought. That has to be handled with a lot of care. I created a funnel to show this process because the integration vice president needs to manage it. Schedules all the meetings. Anything that's going to happen is up to our integration vice president. And what you can say, what you can't say. There's a lot of silence and some secrecy. It's a very sensitive thing when a company is going to be bought and downsized. Or it could be upsized. We're not sure if the company grows, it grows. And then I like to add in quizzes to reinforce the knowledge, make sure everyone's paying attention. And then I go into our SE7 process, which is the core of this particular client. It's a ship every 7. Relatively fundamental, but of course it gets very detailed when you think about coding, engineering, releasing, bug checking, fact checking, all that kind of thing. Talk a lot about that. What the principles of ship every 7 are. Planning, building, testing, demoing, releasing, failing it, repeating. And the purpose. Very important part of the process. And I do a small quiz on this as well. And when we talked about our import process, pairing, this relates to knowledge transfer, which has to happen, otherwise nothing will happen with the company. And it has to be done in a very effective way. Which is known as pairing. It's mission critical. It's when our legacy team and ESW get together and we've got to transfer this knowledge. between these 7 teams, or assembly lines as we like to call them. And I always like to illustrate this a little bit further with a description. Again, pairing is a very effective way to transfer knowledge. Rather than I buying a company looking at all their process, I'm now talking to all the people that ran in that particular area, recording it, and developing some kind of knowledge transfer, maybe a test or new documentation on the process. So we have tracking sheets for that as well. Here's a further explanation of what it looks like. We have our navigator, our driver, and our primary driver. Just like to illustrate it with as much information as possible. Something I don't really like to do as much in training is put a lot of links to outside sources, but sometimes it's necessary to illustrate the process. And of course, when they hired me, I developed the learning management system known as Central Training. It now has over, let me see, I think 275 courses, give or take. And I explain that here. Learning management system called Central Training. They didn't have one before, and they're buying companies, and they didn't have a proper way to transfer the knowledge and onboard new employees. So this was very successful, actually. Took a while to get it done, and by a while in this company, 3 months. I know other companies spend years, but we move very fast around here at ESW Capital, the client that I'm currently doing a project for. So this talks all about Central Training, how the system works.
Large volumes of complex data. To adequately an incoming employee, they is hired to run Central Training. I'd like to take this opportunity to walk through the process.
So I'll keep going. So Central Training was built, classified, and developed to retain as much knowledge as possible for core support and engineering, actually. So each team member can be what's called a power user, and here, that's where I talk about it here. Very important for their particular organization. Next, we have a quality bar process that we recently implemented to make the absorption faster and move along, kind of like a Toyota assembly line it was modeled after. We basically took all the tasks, everything that was done during the acquisition, and we mapped them to a quality bar. And what is a quality bar? It's basically like a work unit business value. So here I talk a lot about that. So they're business values, and they represent key processes to take the legacy company through the import process and form fit it to Central Factory. That's basically all we're doing. So to do that, we need what's called an input quality bar. I think the graphic I put in here that illustrates it the best is probably this. If you look at this, I did a recording, it was 7 minutes, to help the new hire in this role understand the input, the process, and the output. So of course you start with an input quality bar, and then there's some quality bars which are related to complete the quality bar. And this goes into further detail about how the quality bars work in the workflow. They're all set up. We have a fantastic computer engineer that sets this up in Smartsheets and makes the workflow very, very efficiently and syncs it with the outcomes and how fast things are done. And I talk a little bit further about how the dashboards are displayed. And it gives you an understanding of the progress that's being made on the project as the 90 days fly by.
is just to show you progress is into one location.
So that's it. Everything that we've done with quality bars syncs up with our executive dashboard to display the progress, as you might be able to take a look at here, the progress here. And then I like to do a knowledge check for questions, just to refresh people's memory. Can never hurt. Of course, and whenever you're doing training, you gotta double check, make sure everything's right. There's nothing worse than producing training that is not right from an infrastructure standpoint, SaaS ops. And finally, the fun part is the tools that are utilized to track the progress. We use Jira, Betterworks, and Smartsheets. Everything happens in Smartsheets to begin with, and then it's synced up with Jira, which goes to our work streams. And do a lot of recordings to do my best to show how they all work together and who does what. And the integration plans work, that sort of thing. It's not easy to track everything that happens at such a fast pace, but we created a very, very efficient system that works, tracks everything, and shows up to the minute progress every minute of every day, since we are a global team working around the clock. Fantastic new dashboards, spotlight reports, and so forth. And I do a knowledge check on this as well. And I always try to put updated knowledge about how they work together, just to reinforce the learning. And how Jira tickets flow. And of course, we have tools that we use to show, well, Confluence shows a lot of the integration data, so I put that in there too, just to make everything complete. It's a lot of information to absorb just for one class, but they're not timed. They can log in, log out, and take it as needed. For example, how we do our business value calculations. Step by step. Until we can deliver each quality bar, which is a business unit. And this is our import budget that we do once we decide to buy the company. Order size planned, order size completed. And at the end, I have an overall knowledge check. With our key phases of our integration. And of course, to conclude my training, I always have to put a test. Usually I time it, and each person has to pass it at 80% or higher. Just make sure that they all understand they read everything, and they have a general understanding. Thank you for listening to my very long explanation of a training module I did for a role called Integration Vice President.